The latest polling by NPR, PBS, and Marist shows former Vice President Joe Biden and Senator Bernie Sanders leading the field to take on President Trump in the general election.
So what might put Sanders over the top? According to Eric Blanc, labor unions could be the decisive factor in efforts to overcome the Democratic Party establishment, oust Trump, and ultimately win transformative social change. Eric joins us now to expand on this. He's a former high school teacher and author of the great book, Red State Revolt, The Teacher Strike Wave, and Working Class Politics. He also is a Bernie Sanders surrogate. Great to see you, Eric. Great to have you in person.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Good to see you.
So talk a little bit about this new piece that you wrote and how the labor movement could be key, both for Democratic Party victory, but specifically for Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, so the big picture is that it's good to fight back, but it's even better to fight back and win. And so the real question for us as the left is how do we win and how do we actually start winning? I don't think you can do that without the labor movement, because in order to take on the billionaires, you need real power. And that's what unions bring to the table. Unions can shut down any company, any public institution just by withholding their labor. And so we've seen that all across the country in the last year. Think about the teacher strikes that paralyzed West Virginia, Arizona, Oklahoma, Kentucky. And so Kentucky is a great example because you saw that not only were they able to make these huge victories against a reactionary Republican government, they were able to translate that economic power into political power, and they ousted from the governor's mansion Matt Bevin, who's like one of the worst politicians in the country, real enemy of all ththings good. So if we're thinking about what it's going to take on a long-term scale and in the primary to win, I don't think you can do that without a fighting labor movement. Unions have always been at the fore of the fight against economic inequality, taking on the billionaires, and that's really the task if we're going to win right now and in the long term.
So I think you're right, Eric, but one of the things that's always puzzled me is Bernie Sanders unequivocally, he runs on this working class politics platform. Unions are not 100% with him, maybe if you poll them, but leadership by and large is really all over the map on this, even some respects with Joe Biden. Why do you think that is, and what is your and the campaign's plan to change that?
Right, so the first thing to say is that Bernie has already won more endorsements than any other candidate. He's got 10 union endorsements. Nobody else is even close at this point.
Sure.
Biden's got 2. Mayor Pete's got a big fat 0. And so what we're talking about is a lot of unions are starting to learn the lessons from 2016, which was that in 2016, there was early endorsements by union leaderships of a pro-corporate Democrat. 43% of union households ended up voting for Trump because Trump seemed like he was an anti-establishment candidate. And so I think the problem is that a lot of union leadership still haven't endorsed. It's true what you say. Most haven't yet sided. But this is because there's a long-standing problem of union leaderships being way too cozy with the Democratic Party establishment, right? And this is a failed strategy. What has that brought us over decades? It's brought us a decline in unionization rates. We're way lower than most other countries in the world. It's the reason we don't have universal health care. And so if you look at Biden, for instance, or Bernie, the choice should be really clear. Under a Bernie Sanders administration, what are you going to get? You're going to get a working class government, as he calls it, that fights to double unionization rates by giving every worker, without exception, the right to unionize, every worker, without exception, the right to strike. That's going to push for Medicare for all. That's going to push for a Green New Deal that would create millions of new jobs all across the country, right? So that's one option you have. On the other hand, unfortunately, there's a lot of unions who I think, leaderships at least, who are seriously considering Biden. Mayor Pete, I'm not so worried about. But Biden, let's talk about Biden. Biden has this scrappy, working class dude from Scranton vibe going on, but let's be real. He's bond paid lock, stock, and barrel by the billionaire class, right? So that's what I find so infuriating about Biden, is that on the one hand, he has this persona, but really what he's doing is what he's sticking with Hillary Clinton's rule of thumb, is that you have a public position, you have to have a private position, right? So Biden's public position is with the workers, right? His private positions, he tells the billionaire class that nothing is going to change for them.
Right.
And think about what Biden has actually done when he had power. He helped pass NAFTA, right? So he talks about Scranton. Let's talk about Scranton. Scranton has lost thousands of good union-paying jobs, right, because of the trade policies that Biden supported. Think about what Biden and Obama did. Instead of bailing out Main Street, they bailed out Wall Street. Millions of people lost their homes. So I think that the choice for unions should be clear, but it's going to take a lot of pressure to break this, long-term tendency to be risk-averse and to just do backroom deals with the Democratic Party establishment.
And how do they? The records couldn't be more clear, right? If you're just looking from a labor perspective, Sanders has basically consistently been on the right side of history, and Biden has basically consistently been on the wrong side of history. Not to mention incredibly cozy, especially with the credit card companies that are based in Delaware, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're the leader of a major American union, how do you square that circle? How do you convince yourself that Biden is in fact the right guy to go with?
Well, I think part of the difficulty here are just the long-term connections. Union leaders who've been doing this for decades are just used to a certain type of doing politics. It's not just purely a strategic issue. Some of them, and I think we should be honest, some of them are worried about electability questions. And so the responsibility for anybody who's supporting Bernie is to make it clear, just what the polls are showing, that actually Bernie is our best bet to beat Trump. This is, I think, an argument that we just have to hammer over and over and over again, is that the record of trying to run centrist Democrats to beat the Republican and the right wing is not working, right? And so for the case to union leaders and to union members all across the board is that not only is Bernie better on policy, because everybody, to be honest, acknowledges that. You go to a union meeting, and if you watch the events that Bernie's done across the country, the Teamsters everywhere, the standing ovations always go to Bernie. The question is, how do we make the case that Bernie's not only the best policy-wise, but he's the best bet to beat Trump? And I think that that is clear, and more people are seeing that now that he's rising in the polls.
So that's what I want to talk with you about there, is that healthcare piece, because that's what it all comes down to. And regardless, I mean, the push is always, listen, the reason that unions should support Medicare for all, that's what I hear from the Bernie campaign, is that means that it would take that off the table and they could bargain for even more rights. But a lot of people, I think maybe rightfully so, say, hey, wait, we negotiated very, very, very hard for this. This is kind of the Joe Biden position. What, in your discussion with union leaders and with union members in particular, how has that argument resonated with Joe Biden, and what's your most effective counter to that?
Yeah. To be honest, I don't think it's a very hard case to make.
Yeah.
Because first and foremost, what the corporate Democrats and the Republicans, because they're using the same basic talking point, what they're doing is trying to confuse people and make it seem like what you're going to lose is your access to your healthcare professionals, to your doctors. And that's clearly not what people want. So when we explain that Medicare for All is not going to just boot you from your existing healthcare that you have, but is actually going to be able to expand that to other workers. You're going to be able to keep your doctors, right? You're going to be able to keep amazing healthcare, and in some ways, in many places, expand it. That is the case to union members and to union leaders. And what you mentioned before is crucial. It's not just the issue about the immediate health care, but are you going to be able to keep your health care? Here's an example, right? Pete Buttigieg is, a attack dog against Medicare for All at this point. But think about the workers in Honeywell, who are the workers in South Bend, who lost their health care just this past year. They had amazing health care benefits, and the corporation took it away. So if you want to guarantee health care benefits for the long term, none of our health benefits are safe until you have a Medicare for All
program. I want to seize on one thing you said. You said you're going to be able to keep your doctor. Very famous phrase that President Obama and Joe Biden said under the Affordable Care Act. Do you think that the mistrust and basically the boondoggle of an Affordable Care Act makes the Medicare for All conversation more difficult?
No, I don't think so. I think it's the opposite. Part of the reason,
because people lost their doctors and people's deductibles went up and the costs went up. I mean, there's no question that's
right, of course. But but that's the case for Medicare for All, because the issue is once you keep the private insurers and you have this incredibly convoluted process, which the Affordable Care Act was. It was very complicated. In the same way that all of these halfway house measures that the corporate Democrats are pushing right now is very complicated, and it lends itself towards exactly these types of slippages. Medicare for All, what it would do is vastly simplify it, get rid of this bureaucracy, and it would make it clear what the stakes are. And that's ultimately, I think, what we're having to win. If we're going to win the majority of people, we have to have a very clear plan and a clear vision, and anything in between, people are not going to want to really lean into, and they're not going to fight for.
One thing that's been clear to me is Republicans have long understood how important organized labor is to the Democratic Party, and Democrats have long taken them for granted. And I hope and I feel like that may be starting to turn around. Eric, always great to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric.
Great. Thanks for having me on.
Next on Rising, friend of the show, Don Calloway shares why he's supporting former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick in the 2020 primary.
And why he says there is still a lane open for Patrick in the race. Interesting interview. That's going to be next.